As the 1970s drew to a close, Harlem was a place transformed yet holding on to its core identity. Jack Garofalo's photographs, while not seen, resonate through their stories. They speak of a community rich in history, culture, and the indomitable spirit of its people. His work serves as a testament to the soul of Harlem, capturing the essence of a neighborhood that has always been more than just a place on a map. It's a vibrant, living entity, its story told through the lives of those who called it home. In the 1960s, Harlem was not merely a backdrop for the civil rights movement, it was an active participant, a crucible where the fires of change were stoked. This was a time when the very air of Harlem seemed charged with the electricity of social upheaval. The neighborhood, with its rich tapestry of African American culture, was a focal point for both struggle and celebration, where the call for equality resonated through its streets. The decade saw Harlem grappling with systemic inequalities that had festered for generations. It was an era where the youth, in particular, felt the sting of injustice, not just in Harlem but across the nation. The schools in Harlem were among the battlegrounds where these tensions came to a head. School boycotts became a symbol of resistance, a way for students to voice their frustration with substandard education systems that were failing them. Enter Jack Garofalo, a French photographer whose lens would become a tool to capture these pivotal moments. Commissioned by Paris Match magazine, Garofalo was no stranger to documenting the undercurrents of society, but Harlem presented a unique challenge. Here, he wasn't just capturing images, he was capturing the heartbeat of a community in transition. Garofalo's work began with the school boycotts. The images he captured were not of violence or chaos, but of determination and unity. Children and teenagers, some barely out of elementary school, stood on the streets, signs in hand, chanting for their rights. There was an air of solemnity in these protests, a gravity that spoke of a generation tired of being overlooked. His photographs showed the faces of these young activists, their expressions a mix of hope, anger, and a nascent understanding of their place in history. But Harlem's story in the 1960s was not solely one of protest. Garofalo's lens also found moments of community resilience. He documented the everyday life that continued amidst the turmoil. There were street corners where old men played chess, children jumping double dutch, and families gathering for Sunday dinners. These images, juxtaposed with the protests, painted a portrait of a neighborhood that was both in struggle and in celebration of its culture. The photographer's approach was not to sensationalize, but to humanize. He captured the essence of Harlem, not through the lens of an outsider looking in, but as someone who sought to understand the depth of its experiences. His photographs of the 1963 Harlem rent strike, for instance, showed families standing together, not just for lower rents, but for dignity and respect in their own homes. Garofalo's work in Harlem was not without its challenges. As an outsider, gaining the trust of the community was paramount. He spent time in the neighborhood, not just as a photographer, but as an observer, a listener, and sometimes a participant in the daily life. His photographs began to reflect a deeper understanding of Harlem's complexities, capturing moments of joy alongside the struggle. The images from the 1964 riots, following the murder of a black teenager by a white police officer, were stark reminders of the racial tensions that could erupt into violence. Yet Garofalo's photographs from this period also highlighted the community's response, the cleanup, the vigils, the community meetings where people came together to heal and plan for a better future. Throughout his assignment, Garofalo captured the voices of Harlem, both literal and figurative. His photographs of street orators, who turned corners into podiums, spoke to the power of words in a community fighting for change. These images showcased Harlem as a place where the spoken word was not just a means of communication, but an instrument of empowerment. In documenting Harlem's struggles and triumphs, Jack Garofalo's work became more than a collection of photographs. It was a narrative, a visual diary of a neighborhood at a crossroads. His lens, through the pages of Paris Match, brought the story of Harlem to an international audience, not as a tale of despair, but as a testament to the enduring spirit of a community striving for justice, equality, and a rightful place in the tapestry of American life. Jack Garofalo's work in Harlem did not end with the 1960s. His lens continued to capture the evolving narrative of the neighborhood as it moved into the 1970s. This was a decade where Harlem would experience new forms of activism, cultural renaissance, and the rise of new voices, all while grappling with the effects of urban renewal and economic shifts. The early 1970s saw the Black Power movement gaining momentum, and Harlem was one of its epicenters. Garofalo, still commissioned by Paris Match, turned his attention to the organizations and individuals who embodied this movement. His photographs captured the Black Panthers in action, not just in their militant stance, but in their community programs. He documented their free breakfast programs, their health clinics, and their efforts to educate and empower the community. These images portrayed a different facet of the movement, one focused on self-determination and community upliftment. As Harlem navigated through economic challenges, Garofalo's lens focused on the people who lived through these times. He photographed the everyday struggles, like the long lines at welfare offices, the boarded-up buildings, and the resilience of families making do with what they had. Yet, amidst this, there was also a celebration of culture. Harlem was a place where music, poetry, and dance thrived as forms of resistance and expression. Garofalo's images of jazz clubs, poetry readings, and block parties showcased a community that refused to be defined solely by its hardships. The cultural renaissance of the 1970s in Harlem was marked by the emergence of figures like Gil Scott-Heron and the Last Poets, who gave voice to the political and social issues of the time through music and spoken word. Garofalo's photographs of these artists, performing in intimate venues or on street corners, captured the raw energy and the profound message of their work. These images were not just of performances, they were portraits of a community's soul, its anger, its dreams, and its hope. Urban renewal projects, often criticized for their displacement effects, began to reshape Harlem's landscape. Garofalo's camera recorded the demolition of old tenements, the construction of new housing projects, and the protests against these developments. His images showed the duality of progress, the promise of new beginnings, and the pain of lost homes and disrupted lives. He captured the faces of those who had to leave their homes, the children playing amidst rubble, and the community meetings where people debated their future. By the mid-1970s, Harlem's political landscape was also changing. Garofalo documented the rise of figures like David Dinkins, who would later become the first African-American mayor of New York City, showing the community's engagement with politics as a means of change. His photographs of political rallies, voter registration drives, and community leaders speaking at events painted a picture of a neighborhood actively participating in its own governance. Throughout this period, Garofalo's work reflected the personal stories that made up Harlem's collective narrative. He photographed the neighborhood's matriarchs and patriarchs, whose wisdom and experiences were the threads that wove the community together. There were images of young couples in love, of children growing up, of families adapting to new circumstances. These personal narratives added depth to the historical account, showing Harlem not just as a place of struggle, but as a vibrant, living community. As the 1970s drew to a close, Garofalo's work in Harlem came to encapsulate a neighborhood in transition. His photographs, while not seen, were a testament to the resilience of Harlem, capturing moments of both adversity and advancement. They spoke of a community that, despite the challenges, continued to nurture its cultural, political, and social identity. Through Jack Garofalo's lens, the world saw Harlem not just as a neighborhood, but as a living, breathing entity with its own heartbeat, its own story, and an indomitable spirit that refused to be quelled. As the 1980s dawned, Harlem continued to be a focal point of cultural expression, political activism, and community resilience. Jack Garofalo, whose work had become synonymous with the narrative of Harlem, remained committed to documenting this vibrant neighborhood. His photographs from this era provide a window into Harlem's evolution, capturing both the continuity of its spirit and the new challenges it faced. The 1980s in Harlem were marked by the rise of hip-hop, a cultural phenomenon that would not only redefine the neighborhood's identity but also influence global culture. Garofalo's lens was quick to capture this emerging scene. He photographed young DJs spinning records in makeshift setups in parks and community centers, graffiti artists turning walls into canvases, and breakdancers who turned the streets into stages. These images were not just of performances. They were portraits of a community expressing itself in new, vibrant ways. But the 1980s were also a time of economic hardship for Harlem. The crack epidemic ravaged many neighborhoods, and Harlem was no exception. Garofalo's work during this period was poignant, capturing the stark contrast between the burgeoning cultural scene and the devastating impact of drugs on the community. His photographs showed the human toll, the addicts on street corners, the families torn apart, and the community's efforts to combat the epidemic. There were images of drug prevention programs, community meetings, and the tireless work of activists and social workers trying to heal the neighborhood. The political landscape of Harlem in the 1980s was also evolving. Garofalo documented the rise of figures like Charlie Rangel, who would serve Harlem in Congress for decades. His photographs of political rallies, voter turnout drives, and community leaders speaking at events illustrated Harlem's continued engagement with politics, seeking representation and solutions to its pressing issues. One of the most significant events of the 1980s for Harlem was the restoration and reopening of the Apollo Theater in 1985. Garofalo was there, his camera capturing the excitement, the anticipation, and the pride as Harlem's iconic venue was brought back to life. His images of the grand reopening, with artists like Stevie Wonder and Maya Angelou performing, symbolized a cultural resurgence, a beacon of hope amidst the challenges. However, the 1980s also saw the beginning of gentrification in Harlem, a process that would accelerate in the coming decades. Garofalo's work began to reflect this shift, capturing the arrival of new residents, the opening of new businesses, and the transformation of certain areas. Yet his photographs also conveyed the tension between old and new, the concerns of longtime residents about being priced out of their homes, and the preservation of Harlem's cultural identity. In the realm of activism, Garofalo's lens continued to focus on the grassroots movements. He documented the work of organizations like the Harlem Children's Zone, which aimed to uplift the community through education and social services. His images of children in after-school programs, community gardens, and educational workshops painted a picture of a neighborhood fighting for its future, one child at a time. The personal stories of Harlem continued to be a central theme in Garofalo's work. He photographed individuals whose lives were emblematic of the community's resilience. There was Ms. Jackson, who ran a local bookstore, providing a haven for readers and writers in a neighborhood where literacy and education were paramount. Or young Jamal, whose journey from the streets to college was captured over several years, showcasing the potential for transformation within Harlem's youth. As the decade progressed, Garofalo's photographs also began to reflect a changing narrative around Harlem's identity. While the neighborhood still faced significant challenges, there was a growing sense of pride in its cultural contributions to the world. His work in the late 1980s captured Harlem's festivals, its art scenes, and the emergence of new voices in literature and music. By the end of the 1980s, Jack Garofalo's documentation of Harlem had evolved into a comprehensive visual chronicle of a community in constant flux. His photographs, while not seen, were a testament to Harlem's enduring spirit, capturing moments of both adversity and renewal. They spoke of a neighborhood that, despite the challenges, continued to nurture its cultural, political, and social identity, a place where the heartbeat of its people remained strong, pulsating through the streets, the stages, and the stories of those who called Harlem home.